My third guest in the Plant Blindness series is Dr. Jessica White. Jess is a lecturer at the University of Queensland and a writer. And her area of research is, in particular, following the work of Georgiana Malloy, who was the first Australian female scientist and botanist. And Jess is also the author of 2 novels, A Curious Intimacy and Entitlement, and she just recently published a book called Hearing Maud, which is a creative non-fiction book. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for coming and talking to us today. Yep. So I'm particularly interested in our crossovers and our mutual research in terms of trying to find crossovers between narrative and plant life. Yeah. And in particular, what we have in common, I believe, is an interest in the concept or the genre of an ecobiography. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but maybe you could start by telling me a little bit about, your experiences with narrative and the world of plants.
Yeah. So in the ecobiography, which I'm writing at the moment, I define that as a genre which shows the way in which an environment shapes a self. So biography is of a person, ecobiography is of their interaction with the environment. So writing about Georgiana Malloy, she emigrated from Carlisle in England to Augusta in southwest Western Australia in 1829. She arrived in 1830 and she had a really tough time when she turned up. They were the first white people in the area and she had a daughter 2 weeks after she arrived and the baby only lived 10 days. And so she dug a grave for the child and she put some blue native flowers on the grave. So that incident could have meant that she turned against the Australian bush, and a lot of people did. They thought it was, a lot of Europeans thought it was hostile and awful. But instead there was this tentative openness to it. And then she had another 3 girls and then she had a boy. And when the boy was 19 months old, he fell into a well and he drowned. Oh. Yeah, so she had a nervous breakdown. Well, what I interpret as a nervous breakdown. And just prior to that, she'd received a letter and a box of English seeds from an English botanical connoisseur. And he said, here are some English seeds, can you replace them with Australian seeds? Because they were all the rage in England. And she said, I don't have time. But then her son died, and so she went into the bush to take her mind off her grief and started collecting the seeds, and there was this renaissance in herself. She fell in love with collecting and with writing about plants, and she thanked Mangles, she said, for being the cause of her passionate attachment to flowers. And she said, I think this is why I've been sent out to Swan River, is to collect flowers. So she thought it was vocation. But there's 3 biographies of Malloy, and I didn't want to do that because it's just boring. But I wanted to show how critical the flora and the environment of southwest Western Australia was to her personality. So I was using the plants to show how it had shaped her. But because that's such a protected area, it's one of 2 biodiversity hotspots in Australia, I'm trying to draw attention to how significant the plants are in that area. And so I'm also telling the stories of some of the plants and how they, like the millions of years which they grew in that part of the world, and then what happened to them when they were sent to England and renamed, and then sent back. And so Malloy sent the specimens to Mangles. He and his mates named them because she was a woman; she wasn't allowed to name them. I was going to ask you about that. And they sent the names back to her, and she said, "Oh, now I know what they are." But the Indigenous people, the Noongar people, had names for those plants, and that was overwritten. So I'm trying to collate these histories of plants and weave them into Malloy's story, and that's the ecobiography that I'm writing. But it is important to tell the stories of the plants because they were what shaped her sense of self. Very much,
And
yeah.
so that's absolutely fascinating. The idea of like, you know, telling the story of those particular plants to kind of draw out the character of Malloy like a real life person. So
Yeah.
in terms of your narrative process, were there any sort of pitfalls or quicksand, you know, that you slipped into when you, because I understand why you would do that, and it's really interesting, you know, she has that experience as a woman in colonial Australia, an invader of those lands, a stranger in those lands, collecting things, participating in a very patriarchal, male-oriented world, as you say. So how did you, were you aware of that kind of feminine and feminist approach when you were talking about the plants themselves?
Much so, yeah. So botany at that time was a means for women to do science without being criticised
That
for
really
being
doing science.
unfeminine. Yeah. So she was able to take her training and do science in the bush in Western Australia. And she would never have been able to do that unless she'd had that ladylike training. So that was really important, I think. And people say, oh, she wasn't doing science because she wasn't part of an institution, but vernacular science is still science, I think,
So in terms of this kind of field, which you're, you know, across as well, this there is like a kind of a wealth of literature at the moment. It seems that there is a burgeoning, blooming trend of literature, fiction and non-fiction, fiction that's heavily based on biography. And I'm interested if you think that this is a situation where the plant science and the plant knowledge is more available or more widespread, and that authors are responding to that, to new access to that information, or whether you think it's more related to perhaps climate change and issues around plant life and habitat loss and species loss.
Yeah, I think it would definitely be the latter. The science has always been there if you seek it out. Well, it's more available on the internet, and I'm by no means well versed in science. I have to go to the experts.
Yeah.
And those experts have always been there, so you just go in and talk to them. So so I would say it's very much about climate change. Also, it's a bit hipster to be in love with plants these days as well.
Oh, we all agree.
So I don't know, and maybe that's the hipsters being aware.
I do know exactly what you mean, because in terms of like interior designs,
yes, that's what I mean.
Yes, those kind of hipster cafes and restaurants. You know, you can't turn a corner without seeing a bit of moss stuck in the corner of the wall. But I mean, putting that aside,
but maybe that's their awareness of being disassociated from plant life.
Exactly.
Because we're so highly urbanised these
true.
days. Yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. So in terms, so I think we've talked about Richard Powell's The Overstory. We've talked about what other kind of important novels or narrative texts do you think does this well? Because it's a tricky area, and we'll talk about the more pitfalls in a minute. But who do you think does it well? The Peter Wollenben?
Yeah. I really enjoyed his book. It was a bit blokey.
Yes, it was blokey.
Yeah. So he talks about mother trees
and
the caring that mothers do. And I was like, well, dads can be caring as well, you know. They don't get excused just because they're dads. So I found that a bit off-putting. But I thought that what he was trying to do was admirable. He was trying to convey how complex plants are, and that they're not really that different from animals. They're just very slow-moving animals.
Yes.
And I think in terms of, so I think about this a lot, how do we get humans to understand how important plants are? And you have to anthropomorphise them.
Yeah.
Another fantastic one is Hope Yaren's Lab Girl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great book. I love that.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah. You loved it too.
And in that, she does a similar thing. It's just not as overt.
No, it's more biographical, I suppose, as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so she parallels her life with the trees growing up as well.
And really talks about the process, her processes as a scientist in the laboratory.
Yes.
I think that's very attractive and appealing because, I mean, I suspect that part of the problem that we're facing, that in fact I think and maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think narrative can in some ways solve, is that time scale issue.
Yeah.
So narrative, as you and I know, if you're writing a book, it usually takes 2 years or more, 2 years, 10 years. It's a different kind of time scale, and it's also a different type of human consciousness. Like when you slip into your writing mode, you know, it's not quite normal life, is it? So I'm wondering if there's parallels of different kind of consciousness that we do as narrators that might be more similar to plant life than...
That's really interesting. I never thought about that before.
But we have talked about timescales. What do you think about that?
Well, humans are really poor at conceptualising deep time, so they can usually only imagine the generation before them and the generation after them.
Yeah.
So to try to explain the millions of years that plants have been on Earth and how important that is just beyond most humans. But I think, and this is what Hope Yaren does, I think if you translate plant time into human time and say, oh, this plant is X many generations old, then they can see
Makes more sense.
Yeah. So she's pinning it to human time to help us interpret the age of the plants.
Yeah.
And I've also just finished Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain, about the mountains in Scotland, and she talks about the plants and the hills in Scotland.
Because there was a very vibrant 19th century botanical collection, you know, scene in Scotland, wasn't there?
Yeah. And Malloy's contemporary Drummond came from Scotland.
Okay. Right.
And she talks about the plants on that hill having been there since before the Iron Age. And so there's an age, it's a human age. And so, that's her way of explaining how old they are. They were there since before the humans started with their tools, that kind of thing. So she's still pegging it to human time. Yeah.
So if we slip straight into that, the problematic that you and I both have, and in fact everyone in humanities has with this area of knowledge, what are the problems of anthropomorphism? As you say, it's maybe not such a bad thing. But how do we do it well? How do we anthropomorphise in just the right amount that's not disrespectful to the kind of agency and independence of vegetal life? Do you think? You must have struggled with that a little bit?
It's difficult to get away from. I noticed Wollobin doing it. He talks about little trees being like street kids, but you don't have to use human metaphors. You can use other metaphors from the natural world.
That's true.
It's a way of, I think you need to describe plants as something quite different to humans. To capture their alienness. That's really important because they are selves, their lives. The other thing you can do is describe them in aesthetic terms.
Yes.
So Malloy was very drawn to the pretty plants because she was trained in aesthetics. That was part of her feminine identity. And so if you think, the plants are beautiful, we've got to take care of them, that's another way of approaching it. It's like we're trying to say the Great Barrier Reef, like it has incredible ecosystems, but people just want to save it because it's pretty. And it's like, well, that's not the best way to go about it, but at least it's something. I think,
Oh, that reminds me, I think we talked about this before as well, it might be worth mentioning, Ellen Van Nieren's book, Light and...
Heat and Light.
Heat and Light. And she has her plant people who have, so their roots turn into feet.
Yes.
And they go and sort of nourish themselves by putting their roots in the buckets of sand. But isn't there something in that story about the fertilisers being toxic?
They're trying to kill them off. It's a metaphor for colonisation.
That's right.
Metaphor for colonisation. But it's very clever because roots is about place and
belonging.
Yes, Aboriginal people's traditional home and where they come from.
And being kind of violently uprooted from that.
That's right. But the ending of the story is fantastic because it has all the plant people massed on the horizon and the waves are coming and she says, we're going to withstand this. And Aboriginal people have intimate knowledge of Australia and they know how to survive. So they've got to survive climate change because they know the country. So that's what the story's a metaphor for, I think. Yeah.
So we're kind of saying that anthropomorphism is an issue in this field, but handled carefully and
Yes.
thoughtfully
Yes.
could be quite effective.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that in terms of like all this kind of climate change information? What do you think it is that narrative does that other forms of communicating plant science can't do?
Yeah. Narrative always has a protagonist. So that would be a way of foregrounding plants in a story by making them protagonists when usually they're the background.
True.
Yeah. That would be my answer to that question. But just going back to your point about climate change and trying to convey the significance of plants, humans are inherently selfish and self-absorbed. So I appeal to that when I'm writing, and I say, if you want to survive, you need to write the lives of plants and the things that take care of you. So plants give us oxygen. So I say, if you want to write a life, then you have to write the lives that support it. That's what an ecobiography is.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, because if you look at the etymology of the word autobiography, auto means self, bio means life, and graphe is writing. So eco takes the auto out, takes the self out, and makes it about the environment, which is what we are. We're part of the environment.
Yeah.
So I say, if you want to survive climate change, you have to look after the plants, otherwise we're going to die.
Yeah.
I say that a lot
Yeah.
now. Yes.
Hopefully people are listening.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this series of talks is called Plant Blindness,
Yeah.
as you know. And could we just have a little chat about that language, of that phrase? Because as you said before, there's a kind of an ableist element to that term.
Yeah.
We've spoken to Graham Errington, and he said really, you know, the problem with the term plant blindness, even though it's very effective and it conveys a meaning immediately and really pulls us all up straight away going, oh yeah, it's true, we only see them as an inert background to human action rather than active, agented, independent objects as part of an ecology. What do you think about the term plant blindness?
Yeah, I'm a bit ambivalent about it because, well, I'm quite deaf. I only hear it this year, but that doesn't mean I don't listen.
Yeah.
So when people use the metaphor to be deaf too, it's incorrect because deaf people are never not listening.
Yeah.
They're just listening with their eyes. They're reading things, and that's how they listen. So to say that someone who is blind doesn't have vision is incorrect because they do see. They're just seeing with their fingers. When they do Braille, they're touching the board around them. So they're getting the information. They are seeing things, but in a different way to people who have sight.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, isn't it? Because so actually it makes me feel more comfortable with the term really now that I've heard that from you, because you know, plant blindness is just reminding us that even though we can see, we all have a problem with seeing the sum as opposed to the parts. It's very difficult to see the parts of, for instance, or any vegetal thing without understanding all the elements that go into it. So I remember with my students a couple of years ago, I pointed to something outside the window and I didn't want to name it, but I said that thing that's growing and has a trunk and branches and leaves and just incredible activity inside, and you know, movement and vascular energy and, you know, all of that sort of stuff, all that activity, that complex behaviour that's happening out the window.
Yeah.
And I asked them to try to describe it without naming it.
Oh, okay.
And it was an interesting exercise because what I realised was that we find it very difficult to talk about both the sum and the parts at the same time, both the activity and the human perceptual experience of the tree.
Yeah. So I was trying to write a plant history of a species, Leschenantia biloba. So I traced it from deep time, though it's split from its clade and became a subspecies. And when the Europeans first encountered it and gave it a European name, and when it was sent to England and grown and shown in horticultural shows where it got prizes. And looking at it now, where they're doing molecular testing to work out where its blue comes from and how it's constituted chemically. So that's how I'm trying to tell a story of one particular plant. But in terms of weaving that into the book, I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, because that's quite a chunky description, that whole thing. So I don't know how I'm going to do it, but it's going to be in there.
Yeah, it'll be in there, and it will reveal something about Georgiana Malloy.
Yeah.
Through not just that kind of physical, material, historical, you know, scientific information, but just what that reveals about us. So that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And so, Jess, what else are you working on, you know, just in the immediate future?
This one, it's going to take me about a year and a half to finish it. But then I've got a whole lot of environmental activist fiction that I want to write.
Yeah.
So one's about the deforestation in Queensland. One's about a near future climate fiction novel about a deaf farmer and bees. And one's about mermaids and climate change, and trying to tell the story of climate change through the oceans. So pretty busy.
Yes, that sounds fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about narrative and plants, and hopefully we'll keep in touch.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Prue.